In the autumn of 1610, a woman named Catalina de Arauso stood in a stone cell beneath the tribunal of the Inquisition in Logroño, Spain, listening to footsteps approaching down the corridor. Catalina was 42 years old, a midwife who had delivered babies throughout her village for nearly 20 years, a woman known for her skill at helping difficult births, and for her knowledge of herbs that could ease pain and reduce fevers. 3 weeks earlier, she had been arrested by officers of the Inquisition on charges of witchcraft. The evidence against her was that she had successfully delivered a baby that 2 other midwives had declared impossible to save, that she grew strange plants in her garden, and that a neighbor woman had dreamed that Catalina had appeared in her bedchamber at midnight, accompanied by a black cat. Catalina had not been allowed to see her family since her arrest. She did not know what had happened to her husband or her 3 daughters. She had been questioned repeatedly about her midwifery practices, about the herbs she used, about whether she had made pacts with the devil. She had denied everything. She had insisted that her knowledge came from her mother and grandmother, who had also been midwives, that her herbs were common plants used for healing throughout Spain, that she had no connection to any demonic powers. The inquisitors had not believed her, or rather, they had not cared whether her denials were true, because the Inquisition operated on a simple principle, quote, accusations of witchcraft were almost never false, and denial of guilt was simply further evidence of the devil's influence over the accused. Now, after 3 weeks of interrogation that had produced no confession, the footsteps approaching Catalina's cell signaled that the Inquisition was moving to the next phase of her persecution. The door opened. 2 guards entered along with an inquisitor and a notary who would record everything that happened. The inquisitor looked at Catalina with an expression that mixed contempt with what might have been pity, and he told her that since she had refused to confess her crimes voluntarily, she would now be questioned with rigor until the truth was extracted from her. Catalina was dragged from her cell and down a corridor to another room, a room she had heard whispered about during her weeks of imprisonment, a room that every prisoner feared. It was the torture chamber of the Inquisition, and what happened to Catalina in that room over the next 8 hours would break her body and her mind so completely that she would confess to anything and everything the inquisitors wanted to hear. She would confess to making pacts with demons. She would confess to poisoning babies and causing miscarriages. She would confess to flying through the night to attend gatherings of witches where they worshipped the devil. She would name other women as her accomplices in witchcraft, and every word of her confession would be false, extracted through agony so intense that death would have seemed preferable. But death was not offered, because the Inquisition needed her alive to validate their accusations and to implicate others. But before I tell you what happened to Catalina in that torture chamber, before I describe the specific methods the Inquisition used to break her, before I reveal how her story ended, I need to tell you about the system that created this horror, about how the Spanish Inquisition transformed the persecution of supposed witches into an industrial-scale operation that destroyed thousands of women's lives across Spain and its colonies over more than 3 centuries. Because what happened to Catalina was not unusual. It was not an aberration or an excess by particularly cruel individuals. It was the system working exactly as designed, a system built on misogyny and religious paranoia, a system that used torture and terror to maintain social control, a system that understood that targeting women, particularly women who had knowledge or independence, or who simply failed to conform to every expectation of feminine behavior, was an effective way to keep entire populations fearful and obedient. This is the story of the most horrific methods the Spanish Inquisition used on women accused of witchcraft. And I need you to understand from the beginning that everything I am about to describe is documented in the records of the Inquisition itself, preserved in archives in Spain and throughout former Spanish territories, recorded by the inquisitors who carried out these persecutions because they believed they were doing God's work and wanted to document their efforts. If you want to understand how systematic persecution of women has functioned throughout history, how religious institutions have used accusations of witchcraft to control female behavior, how torture can be bureaucratized and systematized and carried out by people who believe they are righteous, then you need to watch this entire video. Subscribe to this channel right now because what you're about to learn will change how you understand the intersection of misogyny, religious extremism, and institutional violence. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let me tell you about how the Spanish Inquisition's persecution of supposed witches developed. Because to understand what happened to Catalina, you need to understand the worldview that made her torture seem not just acceptable, but necessary to the men who ordered it. The Spanish Inquisition was established in 1478 by the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, initially to ensure the orthodoxy of those who had converted to Christianity from Judaism or Islam. The Inquisition had authority throughout Spain and eventually throughout Spain's vast colonial empire in the Americas and the Philippines. It was a religious court system that operated parallel to and often superseded civil courts, with its own prisons, its own rules of evidence and procedure, and its own methods of extracting confessions. The Inquisition's focus on witchcraft developed gradually over the 15th and 16th centuries, as religious authorities throughout Europe became increasingly obsessed with the idea that Satan was actively working to corrupt Christians through human agents, witches who had made pacts with the devil, and who used demonic powers to cause harm. This obsession was fueled by theological texts that claimed to expose the reality of witchcraft and to provide methods for identifying and prosecuting witches. The most influential of these texts was the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, written in 1487 by German inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. This book argued that witchcraft was real, that it was primarily practiced by women, and that women were particularly susceptible to demonic influence because of their supposedly weaker faith, their greater carnality, and their natural tendency toward deception. The Malleus Maleficarum became a bestseller, going through dozens of editions and spreading throughout Catholic Europe, including Spain. It shaped how inquisitors understood witchcraft and influenced the procedures they used to investigate and prosecute accused witches for centuries. The book's misogyny was explicit and extreme. It argued that women were more carnal than men, and therefore more likely to be seduced by the devil. It claimed that women's intellectual inferiority made them unable to resist demonic temptation. It suggested that women's very nature, their sexuality, their emotionality, their supposed tendency to deceive, made them ideal vessels for Satan's work. These ideas were not peripheral to the witch hunts, but central to them. The persecution of witches was, fundamentally, a persecution of women, justified by a theology that portrayed female nature itself as dangerous and corrupt. In Spain, the obsession with witchcraft intensified during periods of social stress. When plague swept through towns, killing thousands, the deaths would be blamed on witches who had supposedly poisoned wells or cast spells to spread disease. When crops failed and famine threatened, people would look for scapegoats and would often fix on women who practiced folk healing or who had knowledge of herbs and natural remedies. When babies died in childbirth or shortly after, a tragically common occurrence in an era of primitive medicine, the deaths would be attributed to witches who had supposedly cursed the births or poisoned the infants. Midwives were particularly vulnerable to accusations because they were present at births and had knowledge of women's bodies and reproductive processes that seemed mysterious and dangerous to male authorities. A midwife who successfully delivered babies might be accused of using demonic powers. A midwife whose patients sometimes died, as was inevitable given the medical knowledge of the time, might be accused of causing those deaths through witchcraft. Healers who used herbs and folk remedies were suspect because their knowledge seemed to challenge the authority of male physicians and priests. The very expertise that made these women valuable to their communities also made them targets for persecution. Widows and unmarried women were also disproportionately accused, A woman without a husband was seen as dangerous, uncontrolled, a threat to social order. She might have property or resources that others coveted. She might live independently in ways that challenged social norms about women's proper place. She might simply be vulnerable, lacking male relatives to protect her from accusations. The stereotype of the witch, as an old, solitary woman, reflected these social dynamics. Such women were easy targets who could be accused without risking powerful male relatives seeking revenge. The accusations themselves could come from anywhere and from anyone. The Inquisition encouraged denunciations, treating anonymous accusations as legitimate grounds for investigation. A woman might be accused by a neighbor with whom she had quarreled over property boundaries, or whose advances she had rejected. She might be accused by another woman who was jealous, or who was trying to deflect suspicion from herself. She might be accused by someone who owed her money and saw accusation as a way to avoid repayment. Once accused, the woman would find that defending herself was nearly impossible because the Inquisition's procedures were designed to produce confessions, not to determine innocence or guilt objectively. Let me tell you about how the accusation process worked, because understanding this is crucial to understanding how the Inquisition destroyed so many lives. The process began with a denunciation, a formal accusation made to the Inquisition. The accuser did not need to provide evidence. They simply needed to claim that the accused woman had exhibited suspicious behavior or that they had witnessed supernatural events connected to her. The accusations might be vague and impossible to verify. She cursed my cow and then it died. I saw her speaking with a demon in the shape of a cat. My child became ill after she looked at him with an evil eye. Once an accusation was made, the Inquisition would begin investigating. Neighbors would be questioned about the accused woman's behavior. Had she been seen gathering herbs at night? Did she own a cat or other animal that might be a familiar spirit? Had any misfortunes befallen people after arguments with her? Did she attend church regularly and with apparent devotion? Was she known to speak against church teachings? The investigation was designed to find evidence of guilt, not to objectively assess whether the accusation had merit. Any unusual behavior, any eccentricity, any deviation from perfect Catholic orthodoxy would be noted and used against the accused. The woman might not even know she was being investigated until officers of the Inquisition arrived to arrest her. The arrest would often happen at night, guards pounding on her door and dragging her from her home without explanation while her family watched in terror. She would be taken to the Inquisition's prison and held there indefinitely, with no access to family or legal counsel, while the investigation continued. And here is where the true horror of the system became apparent. The moment a woman was accused and arrested, her property was confiscated by the Inquisition. This was official policy. The Inquisition would seize the accused woman's home, her land, her money, her possessions, everything she owned. The stated justification was that the property of a heretic belonged to the Church. The practical effect was that the Inquisition was financially incentivized to prosecute accusations, because successful prosecution meant the Inquisition acquired the accused person's wealth. This created a perverse system where wealthy women were particularly vulnerable to accusations because prosecuting them was profitable. A woman who owned valuable property might find herself accused by someone who stood to benefit from the Inquisition seizing that property. Perhaps the accuser owed her money. Perhaps they wanted to acquire her land. Perhaps they simply knew that a successful accusation would be rewarded by the Inquisition. And once the property was seized, the woman had lost the resources she would need to mount any kind of defense or to support herself if she somehow managed to be acquitted. The woman held in the Inquisition's prison would be kept in conditions designed to break her spirit before any formal interrogation began. The cells were small, dark, often underground with no windows and minimal light. Prisoners might be kept in complete darkness for days or weeks, unable to tell day from night, losing all sense of time. The cells were cold and damp, especially in winter, and prisoners were given minimal food, enough to keep them alive but not enough to maintain health or strength. They might be kept in isolation, forbidden from speaking to other prisoners or to guards, experiencing weeks of solitary confinement that would begin to erode their sanity. Sleep deprivation was used systematically. Guards would wake prisoners repeatedly throughout the night, preventing them from getting any sustained rest. Or prisoners would be forced to stand for days at a time, propped against walls, their legs swelling and their bodies aching, denying them the relief of sitting or lying down. The combination of isolation, darkness, hunger, cold, and sleep deprivation was its own form of torture, designed to weaken prisoners physically and psychologically before any formal interrogation began. Eventually, the woman would be brought before inquisitors for questioning. She would be asked to confess her crimes, to admit that she was a witch, that she had made a pact with the devil, that she had used demonic powers to cause harm. She would be told that confession was the only way to save her soul, that continuing to deny her guilt was itself evidence of demonic influence, that the Inquisition already knew she was guilty and was offering her a chance to repent. But before any physical torture was applied, the woman would be subjected to what the Inquisition called tests, procedures designed to identify witches and to humiliate and dehumanize the accused. These tests were presented as objective methods of determining guilt, but they were actually instruments of persecution that were nearly impossible to pass, and that served primarily to break down the accused woman's dignity and resistance. Let me tell you about these tests, because they reveal the pseudo-scientific cruelty that characterized the Inquisition's approach to witchcraft accusations. The first and most common was the search for the devil's mark. Inquisitors believed that when a woman made a pact with the devil, Satan would mark her body with a sign, a mole, a birthmark, a scar, any unusual marking on the skin. These marks were supposedly insensitive to pain and would not bleed when pierced. The accused woman would be stripped completely naked, and her entire body would be examined by male inquisitors and their assistants. Every inch of her skin would be inspected for any mark that might be considered suspicious. The nakedness itself was deeply humiliating in a culture that prized female modesty. The examination was invasive and degrading, men's hands and eyes moving over every part of the woman's body while she stood there unable to protest or cover herself. When a mark was found, and every human body has moles, scars, birthmarks, or other irregularities, so marks were always found, the examiners would test it by stabbing it with a needle or a specialized tool called a witch pricker. The woman would be told not to react, that showing pain would prove the mark was natural, while failing to show pain would prove it was a devil's mark. This created an impossible situation. If she flinched or cried out when stabbed, the examiners might claim she was faking the reaction and stab her again more forcefully. If she managed through extraordinary self-control not to react, or if she was stabbed in an area that happened to have less sensation, this would be taken as proof that the mark was supernatural. The witch prickers used for these examinations were sometimes rigged. Some had retractable points that would appear to penetrate the skin without actually doing so, allowing the examiner to claim that the needle had been inserted without producing blood. Others were simply used with enough force and in enough different locations that eventually a spot would be found that bled less freely than others, or that happened to hurt less, and this would be declared the devil's mark. The search for the devil's mark was not actually about finding evidence. It was about humiliation and about establishing the inquisitor's power over the accused woman's body. She would be forced to stand naked before men for hours while they examined every inch of her skin, discussing her body like she was an object, stabbing her repeatedly with needles while recording their observations. The experience was designed to break down her sense of self, to make her feel violated and powerless, to prepare her psychologically for the worst things that might come if she continued to deny her guilt. Another common test was the ordeal by water, though this was used more in Northern Europe than in Spain proper. The accused woman would be bound, hands tied to feet, or hands and feet tied together, and thrown into a body of water. The logic was that water, being pure and used in baptism, would reject a witch. Therefore, if the woman floated, it proved she was a witch because the water was rejecting her. If she sank, it proved she was innocent because the water accepted her. Of course, a bound woman thrown into water would struggle to keep her head above water, and the binding made swimming impossible, so sinking was likely. But the woman might drown before she could be pulled out, meaning that proof of innocence came at the cost of death. And if she somehow managed to float, or to keep her head above water long enough to be pulled out, this would be taken as proof of guilt. The woman accused of witchcraft would also be subjected to religious tests designed to trap her into giving evidence of demonic influence. She would be forced to recite prayers, the Lord's Prayer, the Ave Maria, the Apostles' Creed, and any stumbling over the words, any mispronunciation, any hesitation would be interpreted as evidence that demons were preventing her from properly invoking God's name. The pressure of being watched by hostile inquisitors, while terrified and possibly weakened from imprisonment, would naturally make anyone nervous and prone to mistakes. But these mistakes would be recorded as evidence of witchcraft. She might be required to touch holy objects, a crucifix, a Bible, blessed water, and her reaction would be scrutinized for any sign of discomfort or reluctance that might indicate demonic influence. She might be subjected to exorcism rituals where priests would pray over her and command any demons possessing her to reveal themselves. If she had seizures or unusual reactions, which might simply be responses to stress, hunger, and terror, these would be interpreted as demonic manifestations. Perhaps most insidiously, the Inquisition accepted spectral evidence, testimony from accusers who claimed to have seen the accused woman's spirit or spectral form in dreams or visions. A witness might claim that the accused witch had appeared to them at night, that her spirit had entered their bedchamber and attacked them while they slept, that they had seen her at a witch's Sabbath gathering worshipping the devil. It did not matter that the accused woman had been miles away at the time, or that there was no physical way she could have been at the location described. The spectral evidence was considered valid because it was believed that witches could project their spirits to appear in multiple places while their bodies remained elsewhere. This spectral evidence made defense almost impossible. How could a woman prove that her spirit had not attended a demonic gathering? How could she demonstrate that she had not appeared in someone's dream? The accuser's subjective experiences, their dreams and visions, were treated as objective reality, and the accused had no way to refute them. After enduring these humiliating tests and preliminary interrogations, if the woman still refused to confess, if she continued to insist on her innocence, to deny that she had any connection to witchcraft, the Inquisition would escalate to formal torture. And this is where the true horror of the system becomes fully apparent, because the torture methods used by the Spanish Inquisition were sophisticated, calculated, and designed not just to cause pain, but to break the victim's will completely, while keeping her alive to confess and to implicate others. Before I describe these torture methods in detail, I need to emphasize something important. The Inquisition maintained detailed records of everything they did. The torture sessions were not secret. They were bureaucratic procedures, carried out in the presence of notaries, who would record every question asked, every torture method applied, every response from the victim. These records survive in archives across Spain and the former Spanish Empire. What I am about to describe is not speculation or legend. These are documented practices, recorded by the inquisitors themselves as part of their official procedures. The torture chamber was typically located in the basement of the Inquisition's building, a stone room with tools and devices specifically designed for extracting confessions. When a woman was brought to this room, she would see the instruments of torture laid out or mounted on the walls: the rack, the strappado rope and pulley, the water torture devices, the various implements for crushing and stretching limbs. Seeing these instruments before any torture began was itself a form of psychological torment, as the woman would anticipate what was about to happen to her. The inquisitors would give her one final chance to confess voluntarily. They would explain that if she confessed now, she would be spared the torture. This was usually a lie. Confessing at this point might reduce the severity of torture, but rarely eliminated it entirely. But the offer would be made to create a sense that the woman had some control over what was about to happen, that she could end this if she would just confess. When she refused, because how could she confess to something she had not done, the torture would begin. Let me tell you about the specific methods used, starting with some of the most common. The rack was a device that consisted of a wooden frame with a roller at each end. The victim would be laid on the frame with their wrists tied to one roller and their ankles tied to the other. Then the torturer would turn the rollers, slowly stretching the victim's body. The pain was immediate and intense as muscles and ligaments stretched beyond their normal range. As the stretching continued, joints would begin to dislocate, first the shoulders, then the hips, then the knees and elbows. The victim would scream and beg for mercy, would promise to confess to anything if only the torture would stop. The inquisitors would ask questions while the torture continued. Do you confess to practicing witchcraft? Do you admit to making a pact with the devil? Who are your accomplices in these crimes? If the woman continued to deny guilt or claimed not to know what the inquisitors wanted her to say, the rack would be tightened further. The torture could continue for hours. The victim's body stretched until permanent damage was done, until ligaments tore and bones were pulled from their sockets. The strappado was another common method. The victim's hands would be tied behind her back. A rope attached to her wrists would be threaded through a pulley mounted on the ceiling. Then the victim would be hoisted into the air by the rope, her entire body weight pulling down on her shoulders, with her arms forced unnaturally behind her. This would cause the shoulder joints to dislocate almost immediately, producing excruciating pain. But the torture did not stop there. Once the victim was suspended, weights might be attached to her feet, adding more strain to the dislocated shoulders. Or the torturer would drop the victim suddenly, letting her fall several feet before the rope caught and jerked her to a stop, the sudden deceleration causing additional damage to joints and ligaments. This dropping and stopping would be repeated multiple times, each drop and stop producing a new wave of agony as partially healed injuries were redamaged. The strappado was particularly cruel because it left relatively few visible marks on the body compared to methods like whipping or burning, but it caused intense pain and permanent damage to joints that might leave the victim unable to use her arms properly for the rest of her life. Water torture was used extensively by the Spanish Inquisition and took several forms. In one method, the victim would be strapped to a table or ladder, tilted so that her head was lower than her feet. Her mouth would be forced open, and a cloth would be placed over her face. Then water would be poured slowly over the cloth, forcing the victim to inhale the water. The sensation was of drowning, of suffocating, unable to breathe as water filled the nose and throat. The victim would choke and gag, her body convulsing as it tried desperately to expel the water and get air. The torture would continue until the victim's stomach was distended with water, bloated and painful. Then the inquisitors would press on the distended stomach, forcing the water back up, causing the victim to vomit water violently. This would be repeated multiple times, the cycle of forced drowning and forced vomiting, continuing until the victim was broken enough to confess. Another form of water torture involved forcing the victim to drink enormous quantities of water, gallons at a time, until the stomach was painfully distended and the victim felt like they were drowning from the inside. The psychological horror of this method was intense. The victim would be forced to swallow and swallow, feeling their stomach expand beyond what seemed possible, feeling like they were going to rupture internally, unable to stop the flow of water being poured down their throat. The garrote was both a torture device and an execution method. The victim would be seated in a chair with their neck in an iron collar. A screw mechanism would be tightened, slowly strangling the victim. The pressure would increase gradually, cutting off air supply, producing the terror of asphyxiation. The victim would be brought to the edge of unconsciousness. Then the pressure would be released, allowing them to breathe and recover. Then the strangling would begin again. This cycle could be repeated many times, each time bringing the victim close to death before pulling back. The psychological torture of the garrote was as bad as the physical torture. The victim would feel their throat closing, would struggle desperately for air, would experience the panic and terror of suffocation. Then, just as consciousness began to fade, air would return. But the relief was temporary, because the victim knew the strangling would resume, that this cycle would continue until they either confessed or died. Crushing devices were used on limbs, particularly the legs. The victim's leg would be placed in a device that looked like a boot made of metal or wood. Wedges would be driven into the device, progressively crushing the leg, breaking bones and destroying tissue. The pain was indescribable, and the damage was permanent. Victims of this torture who survived would often be crippled for life, unable to walk properly. Similarly, fingers and toes might be crushed with specialized tools, each digit broken methodically, while the inquisitors questioned the victim. The hands that had supposedly worked evil magic, the feet that had supposedly walked to witches' gatherings, these would be destroyed piece by piece until the victim confessed. Burning was used as torture before being used as execution. Hot irons would be applied to sensitive areas of the body, the soles of the feet, the palms of the hands, the back, the breasts. The victim would smell their own flesh burning, would feel pain unlike anything that most tortures could produce. The wounds would be severe and prone to infection, but the inquisitors would keep the victim alive, allowing the burns to heal partially before applying hot iron again in new sessions of torture. Psychological torture was woven through all of these physical methods. The inquisitors would threaten the victim's family, telling her that her children would be taken and raised as orphans, that her husband would be accused as her accomplice, that her parents or siblings would be arrested and tortured. These threats were not always empty. The Inquisition did sometimes arrest family members of accused witches, either to extract information or to punish them for association with a heretic. The victim would be told that her torture could end at any time if she would simply confess and name her accomplices. But confessing would not actually end the torture immediately. The inquisitors would want details, would question every aspect of the confession, would demand names of other witches, descriptions of demonic rituals, accounts of harmful magic performed. And if the confessions seemed insufficient or contradicted previous statements, the torture would resume until a more complete confession was extracted. The torture sessions could last for hours or even days, with breaks to allow the victim to recover enough to be tortured again. The Inquisition's regulations technically limited how often and how severely torture could be applied, but these regulations were often ignored or circumvented. A torture session might be officially suspended rather than ended, allowing the inquisitors to resume it later and claim it was a continuation of the original session rather than a new one. Eventually, almost everyone broke. The combination of physical agony, psychological terror, isolation, sleep deprivation, and hopelessness would wear down even the strongest person. The victim would confess to anything the inquisitors wanted to hear. She would admit to being a witch, to making pacts with the devil, to using magic to harm neighbors, to attending nighttime gatherings where witches worshipped Satan and desecrated Christian symbols. The confessions would be recorded by the notary in elaborate detail. The woman would be questioned about when and how she made her pact with the devil. She would describe, or the inquisitors would suggest, and she would agree to, meetings with demons who appeared in various forms. She would confess to specific acts of maleficia, harmful magic, causing the death of a neighbor's cow, making a child sick, ruining crops, preventing pregnancies, or causing miscarriages. She would name other women as her accomplices in witchcraft, women she had seen at the supposed gatherings, women who had supposedly taught her magical practices. These forced confessions were then treated as absolute proof of guilt. It did not matter that they had been extracted through torture. It did not matter that the woman might recant the confession later, claiming she had only confessed to make the pain stop. Once a confession was recorded, it became part of the official record and would be used to convict her and to justify prosecuting the women she had named as accomplices. This is how witch hunts spread and escalated. One accusation would lead to an arrest and torture. The torture would produce a confession that named other women as accomplices. These women would be arrested and tortured in turn, producing more confessions and more names. A single accusation could trigger a cascade of arrests that might destroy dozens or even hundreds of lives in a community. The requirement to name accomplices was particularly cruel. The victim, broken by torture and desperate to make it stop, would be forced to accuse other women, perhaps friends, perhaps relatives, perhaps neighbors she barely knew. She would know that she was condemning these women to the same torture she had endured, but the inquisitors would not relent until she provided names. Some women would make up names, inventing people who did not exist, hoping that this would satisfy the inquisitors without actually harming real people. But often the inquisitors would check the names against records and would demand names of people known to exist in the community. After a confession was extracted, the woman would be returned to her cell to await sentencing. The sentencing would happen at a public ceremony called an Autodafé, literally, act of faith. These were elaborate events that combined aspects of religious ceremony, public trial, and mass spectacle. They were designed to demonstrate the power of the Inquisition and the Church, to terrify the population into obedience, and to ritually expel heretics from the Christian community. The Autodafé would be announced days or weeks in advance, allowing crowds to gather. The accused would be brought out in procession, wearing special garments called sambenitos, yellow robes marked with crosses or flames or demons, designed to mark them as heretics and to humiliate them before the public. Some accused might wear pointed caps called corozas, decorated with images of flames or devils. The procession would wind through the town, giving everyone a chance to see the accused heretics. The crowd would jeer and throw things, rotten food, stones, excrement. The accused women would be forced to walk through this gauntlet of abuse, their faces exposed, their humiliation public and complete. For women who had been respected members of their communities, midwives, healers, mothers, this public degradation was psychologically devastating. At the end of the procession, the accused would be brought to a platform where their sentences would be read aloud. The sentences varied depending on the severity of the supposed crimes and whether the accused had confessed and shown repentance. Some might receive relatively light sentences, public whipping, imprisonment for a term of years, perpetual wearing of the sambenito as a mark of shame, exile from the community. But for those convicted of serious witchcraft, for those who had supposedly made pacts with the devil and caused significant harm through magic, the sentence was death by burning. The phrase used was relaxed to the secular arm. The Inquisition would officially turn the condemned over to civil authorities for execution because the Church claimed not to shed blood directly. This was a legal fiction. Everyone understood that the Inquisition's condemnation was a death sentence. The execution by burning would happen immediately after the Autodafé or shortly thereafter. The condemned woman would be taken to a stake, a wooden post set up in a public square or just outside the town. A pyre of wood would be built around the stake. The woman would be chained to the stake, unable to escape, while the crowd gathered to watch. If the woman had confessed and shown apparent repentance, she might be granted the mercy of garroting, being strangled to death before the fire was lit. The garrote would be tightened until she lost consciousness and died. Then her body would be burned. This was considered merciful because it meant she would not experience the agony of being burned alive. But if the woman had been unrepentant, if she had recanted her confession, or if the inquisitors deemed her insufficiently remorseful, she would be burned alive. The fire would be lit at the base of the pyre. The flames would rise slowly, the heat increasing, the smoke choking. The woman would scream as the fire reached her, as her flesh began to burn, as the pain became unbearable. The crowd would watch, some in horror, some fascinated, some believing they were witnessing God's justice being enacted. Death by burning was one of the most agonizing deaths imaginable. The victim would typically die from smoke inhalation before the flames fully consumed her body, but this could take several minutes of conscious suffering. The psychological horror of watching the flames rise, of knowing what was about to happen but being unable to prevent it, was almost as terrible as the physical agony. After the execution, the woman's body would be left to burn until it was reduced to ash. Her property would remain confiscated by the Inquisition. Her name would be stricken from church records or marked as that of a heretic. Her family would be left orphaned if she had children, disgraced and impoverished, struggling to survive with the stigma of having a witch in the family. But sometimes the persecution did not even end with death. The Inquisition conducted posthumous trials, prosecuting people who had already died for heresies they had supposedly committed while alive. The body might be exhumed from its grave and subjected to a trial. If found guilty posthumously, the remains would be burned and the family's property confiscated. This meant that even women who had died natural deaths might be accused years later, their bodies dug up and destroyed, their families punished for crimes the deceased had supposedly committed. The impact of these persecutions on communities was profound and long-lasting. The constant fear that anyone might be accused, that any neighbor might denounce you, that any unusual behavior or any expression of knowledge that seemed mysterious might lead to arrest, this fear shaped how people lived their lives. Women became hypervigilant about conforming to expectations of proper behavior. They would avoid learning too much about healing or herbs. They would be careful about what they said and to whom. They would distance themselves from anyone accused of witchcraft, refusing to help or defend the accused, even if they believed the accusations were false, because association with an accused witch might lead to accusations against oneself. The witch hunts particularly targeted women who had some degree of independence or knowledge, or who failed to conform to ideal feminine behavior. Widows who owned property became targets because their property could be confiscated. Midwives and healers were vulnerable because their knowledge seemed mysterious and powerful. Women who were outspoken or who challenged male authority, even in small ways, might find themselves accused because they had violated norms about female submission and silence. Modern research in Spanish archives has revealed patterns in who was accused and prosecuted. The accused were disproportionately women, particularly women over 40. They were often women who lived alone, or who had some conflict with their accusers over property or personal disputes. They were women who practiced traditional healing, or who had knowledge of herbal remedies. They were women who, for whatever reason, did not fit perfectly into their communities, or who had made enemies. Very few of these women were actually practicing any kind of witchcraft or maleficent magic. Most were simply women living their lives, trying to help their communities, practicing skills passed down through generations of women. But in a society paranoid about witchcraft and eager to find scapegoats for misfortune, and in a system that profited from confiscating the property of the accused, these women became targets of a persecution machine that destroyed thousands of lives. Let me tell you about some specific cases that have been documented in Inquisition archives, because individual stories help us understand the human cost of these persecutions. In the town of Zugarramurdi, in the Basque region of Spain, a witch hunt in 1609 to 1610 resulted in the arrest of 53 people, mostly women. The accusations began when a young woman named Maria de Chimildegui claimed to have attended a witch's sabbath where she saw various townspeople worshipping the devil. Her accusations triggered a cascade of arrests and interrogations. The accused were tortured until they confessed and named others. The confessions became increasingly elaborate and fantastical. The women described flying through the air to attend gatherings in a meadow, where they would worship a demon who appeared as a goat, where they would feast on the bodies of babies they had killed, where they would perform obscene rituals that violated everything Christian society held sacred. The trial culminated in a massive Autodafé in Logroño in 1610, where several of the accused were burned alive. But an inquisitor named Alonso de Salazar Frias investigated the case afterward and determined that most of the confessions had been false, extracted through torture and suggestion. His investigation revealed that many of the supposedly supernatural events could not have occurred. Accused witches who claimed to have flown to the gathering had been observed in their homes at the time. Babies who were supposedly killed were found to be alive and well, and so on. Salazar's investigation led to reforms in how the Spanish Inquisition handled witchcraft cases, with new regulations requiring more careful verification of accusations. But these reforms came too late for the women who had already been executed, or who had died from torture or imprisonment, and the reforms were not always followed. Witch hunts continued in Spain and its colonies for decades after Salazar's investigation. Let me tell you about Maria de Zozaya, one of the women caught up in the Zugarramurdi witch hunt. Maria was 47 years old, a widow who supported herself and her children by growing vegetables and selling them at the market. She was accused by a neighbor of causing the death of the neighbor's pig through witchcraft. Under torture, Maria confessed to making a pact with the devil when she was younger, to attending nighttime gatherings where witches worshipped demons, to using magic to harm her neighbor's livestock and crops. She named other women as her accomplices, women she had known for years, women who would now be arrested and tortured in turn. Maria recanted her confession after the torture ended, saying that she had only confessed to make the pain stop, that none of it was true. But the recantation was not accepted. She was found guilty at the Autodafé and sentenced to be burned alive as an unrepentant heretic. On the day of her execution, Maria was brought to the stake before a crowd of hundreds. She continued to insist on her innocence, telling anyone who would listen that she had never practiced witchcraft, that her confession had been forced, that she was being killed for crimes she had never committed. Her pleas fell on deaf ears. The fire was lit. Maria screamed as the flames rose around her, her cries audible throughout the town until the smoke finally silenced her. She was one of 11 people burned in that Autodafé, most of them women, all accused of witchcraft based on testimony extracted through torture. In the archives of the Inquisition Tribunal in Toledo, there are records of a woman named Leonor Rodriguez who was prosecuted in the late 16th century for witchcraft. Leonor was a healer who used herbs and traditional remedies to treat illnesses. She was particularly skilled at helping women with fertility problems and with difficult pregnancies, but her success made her suspect. When several of her patients died, inevitable given the limitations of medical knowledge at the time, she was accused of causing those deaths through witchcraft. Leonor was arrested and tortured on the rack. The records describe how the torture was applied progressively over several hours, how Leonor denied any involvement in witchcraft through the first stages of torture, but eventually broke and confessed when her shoulders began to dislocate. Her confession included details about meeting the devil, learning magic from him, and deliberately causing the deaths of patients through poisoned herbs and evil spells. After her confession, Leonor was sentenced to a term of imprisonment and to perpetual wearing of the San Benito. She was released after 5 years, her health destroyed by the torture and the conditions of imprisonment. She was shunned by her community, unable to work, unable to support herself. She died less than a year after her release, possibly from suicide, though the records are unclear. She was 53 years old. Her property, which had been confiscated when she was arrested, was never returned to her or to her children. Now, let me return to Catalina de Arauso, the midwife we met at the beginning of this story. I promised you that I would tell you what happened to her in the torture chamber of the Inquisition in Logroño, and it's time to fulfill that promise. Catalina was brought to the torture chamber after 3 weeks of imprisonment and preliminary interrogation had failed to produce a confession. The inquisitors had decided that she needed to be questioned with rigor, the euphemism the Inquisition used for torture. The charges against her had grown during her imprisonment, as the inquisitors questioned neighbors and gathered information. She was now accused not just of using demonic powers to assist in childbirth, but of causing infant deaths, of using her position as a midwife to poison babies, of meeting with demons in the form of black cats, of teaching other women magical practices, of participating in witches' gatherings. The evidence for all of this remained thin: the neighbor's dream, the suspicion that arose from Catalina's successful practices, the fact that she grew herbs that most people did not recognize. But the Inquisition's procedures did not require strong evidence. Accusations were treated as sufficient grounds for investigation and prosecution. The burden was on the accused to prove innocence, not on the accusers to prove guilt. Catalina was shown the instruments of torture and given one final chance to confess. She refused. She insisted that she was a Christian woman, that she attended Mass regularly, that her midwifery skills came from her mother and grandmother and from years of experience, that she had never harmed anyone and certainly had never consorted with demons. The Inquisitors interpreted her continued denial as evidence of obstinacy and demonic influence. The torture began with the strappado. Catalina's hands were tied tightly behind her back with rough rope that cut into her wrists. The rope was threaded through a pulley in the ceiling. Then she was hoisted into the air, her body weight pulling down on her shoulders with her arms forced behind her. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Her shoulders felt like they were being torn from their sockets. She screamed. The Inquisitors asked her questions while she hung there. Did she confess to practicing witchcraft? Did she admit to making a pact with the devil, who had taught her evil magic? Catalina, gasping in pain, continued to insist she was innocent. The torturer let her drop suddenly, the rope catching her fall with a jerk that dislocated both of her shoulders. She screamed again, a sound of pure agony. This process was repeated several times, hoisting, questions, dropping. Each time, the pain intensified as her already damaged shoulders were stressed again. After perhaps half an hour of this torture, Catalina's resistance began to crack. Between screams, she began to say things that might have been the beginnings of a confession. I did not mean to harm anyone. Perhaps the devil worked through me without my knowledge. I only wanted to help the mothers and babies. But these fragmentary statements were not enough for the Inquisitors. They wanted a full confession with specific details. They lowered Catalina from the strappado and moved to the next torture, the rack. She was laid on the wooden frame, her dislocated shoulders making it agonizing to position her arms. Her wrists and ankles were tied to the rollers. Then the stretching began. As her body was progressively stretched, as joints began to separate and ligaments began to tear, Catalina's resistance collapsed completely. She began to confess to whatever the Inquisitors asked. Yes, she had made a pact with the devil. Yes, the devil had appeared to her in the form of a black cat and had offered to give her powers to help with difficult births in exchange for her soul. Yes, she had used these demonic powers to assist in childbirth. Yes, she had sometimes used her position to harm babies rather than help them, poisoning them or cursing them at the devil's command. The Inquisitors pressed for more details. Had she attended witches' gatherings? Catalina, desperate to make the torture stop, said yes. Where were these gatherings? She named a meadow outside town. Who else attended? The Inquisitors suggested names, other midwives, other healers, women who were known to have knowledge of herbs and healing. Catalina, in her agony, agreed to each name. Yes, those women had been there. Yes, they were also witches. Yes, they had all worshipped the devil together. The notary recorded everything, writing down each confession, each detail, each name mentioned. After 8 hours of torture, Catalina had confessed to a comprehensive catalog of crimes. She had named 6 other women as her accomplices in witchcraft. She had described impossible events, flying through the air, attending demonic rituals, speaking with Satan himself. None of it was true, but it was all recorded as her sworn testimony, extracted in accordance with the Inquisition's procedures. Catalina was returned to her cell, her body broken. Her shoulders were dislocated and would never fully heal. Her joints and ligaments were damaged from the stretching on the rack. She was in constant pain. But the torture was over. at least for now. The Inquisitors had gotten what they wanted, a confession and names of accomplices. The 6 women Catalina had named were arrested in turn. They included her mother, her sister, and 4 other women she had known for years, all of them involved in midwifery or healing. Each of these women was tortured until they too confessed. Each named additional accomplices. The witch hunt spread through the community, ultimately resulting in the arrest of 19 women over a period of 6 months. All of the women were found guilty. 13 were sentenced to imprisonment, public penance, and perpetual wearing of the San Benito. 6, including Catalina, were condemned to death by burning. The Autodafé was held in Logroño in 1611. A massive public spectacle attended by thousands of people from throughout the region. Catalina was 43 years old when she was burned at the stake. She recanted her confession before her execution, telling anyone who would listen that she had only confessed to make the torture stop, that she had never practiced witchcraft, that the women she had named were innocent. But the recantation meant she was classified as an unrepentant heretic, so she was not granted the mercy of being strangled before burning. She died in the flames, conscious and suffering, while the crowd watched. Her husband and 3 daughters were left destitute, their property having been confiscated by the Inquisition. Her daughters, bearing the stigma of having a witch for a mother, never married and lived in poverty for the rest of their lives. The other women burned with Catalina included her own mother, Maria de Arauso, who was 67 years old and who had been a respected midwife in the region for more than 4 decades. The Zugarramurdi Logroño witch trials became one of the most notorious episodes in the Spanish Inquisition's persecution of supposed witches, but they were not unique. Similar hunts occurred throughout Spain and its colonies. In Mexico, in Peru, in the Philippines, wherever the Spanish Inquisition operated, women accused of witchcraft faced similar fates. The psychological legacy of these persecutions lasted for generations. Women learned to police their own behavior, to suppress any knowledge or skill that might seem suspicious, to conform rigidly to expectations of feminine propriety and ignorance. The skilled midwives and healers whose knowledge had been passed down through generations of women were driven underground or disappeared entirely. Medical knowledge that might have helped communities was lost because women were afraid to practice healing for fear of being accused of witchcraft. The Inquisition's persecution of supposed witches was not really about finding witches, because witches as the Inquisition imagined them, women with demonic powers who flew through the night and cast evil spells, did not exist. It was about controlling women, about suppressing female independence and knowledge, about creating terror that would keep populations obedient. It was about generating revenue through the confiscation of property from accused heretics. It was about maintaining the power of the Church and the Inquisition by demonstrating that no one was beyond their reach. The women who were persecuted, women like Catalina and Maria and Leonor and thousands of others whose names have been lost to history, were victims of a system that used religious language to justify misogyny, that bureaucratized torture and transformed cruelty into routine procedure, that destroyed lives methodically and recorded the destruction in official documents as if it were justice. These women deserve to be remembered not as witches but as victims. They deserve to be honored as healers and midwives and mothers and daughters whose knowledge and skills were valuable to their communities. They deserve to be mourned as human beings whose lives were destroyed by a system that targeted them for their gender, their knowledge, and their failure to conform to impossible standards of feminine behavior in a society that viewed women as inherently dangerous and corrupt. The Spanish Inquisition was finally abolished in 1834, more than 3.5 centuries after its founding. By that time, it had prosecuted tens of thousands of people for various offenses, including thousands of women accused of witchcraft. The exact numbers are unknown because many records were destroyed, but historians estimate that several thousand women were executed for witchcraft by the Spanish Inquisition, and many more were tortured, imprisoned, or driven to suicide by accusations and persecution. The legacy of these persecutions extends beyond the specific victims. They established patterns of using accusations of moral or spiritual corruption to target women who deviated from social norms. They demonstrated how religious institutions could systematize violence against women. They showed how torture could be bureaucratized and made routine, and they created cultures of fear that persisted long after the Inquisition itself ended. Understanding this history is crucial because the patterns it reveals, using accusations of supernatural evil to persecute women, extracting false confessions through torture, creating systems where defense is impossible and accusation leads almost inevitably to conviction. These patterns have appeared throughout history and continue to appear in various forms today. The specific belief in witchcraft may have faded, but the underlying dynamics of using accusations of moral corruption to control and persecute women persist. What do you think about this history? How should we remember the women who were persecuted by the Inquisition? What lessons should we draw from studying these practices? Leave your comments below and share your thoughts. If you believe this history needs to be told, that understanding how systematic persecution of women has functioned throughout history is important, then subscribe to this channel and share this video. Hit that subscribe button right now. We explore the darkest aspects of human history, not to sensationalize them, but to understand them, to recognize patterns of persecution and control, to honor the victims who suffered under systems designed to destroy them. The buildings where the Inquisition operated still stand in many Spanish cities. The Plaza Mayor in Madrid, where Autodafé were held and where accused witches were paraded before being executed, is now a tourist destination where people sit in cafes and take photographs. The Inquisition's archives, preserved in Simancas and other locations, contain thousands of pages documenting the persecutions, the torture sessions, the confessions, the executions. The stones remember what happened there, even if most people who visit these places today do not know the details. The archives preserve the names of some of the victims and the records of what was done to them, though most remain anonymous, their suffering recorded only as statistics in the Inquisition's meticulous bureaucracy. Remember Catalina de Arauso, the midwife who delivered babies and helped mothers, and who died screaming in flames for crimes she never committed. Remember Maria de Arauso, the elderly midwife burned alongside her daughter. Remember Leonor Rodriguez, the healer whose skill made her a target. Remember Maria de Zozaya, the widow whose property made her vulnerable to accusations. Remember all the women whose names we do not know, who were accused, tortured, burned, their lives destroyed by a system that claimed to serve God, but that really served the interests of those who profited from persecution and who needed scapegoats to blame for the misfortunes of a harsh and uncertain world. They were people. They had families who loved them. They had skills and knowledge that made them valuable to their communities. They suffered unimaginably under torture and died horrible deaths. They existed. And they deserve to be remembered, not as the witches their persecutors claimed they were, but as the victims of systematic persecution, as women whose gender and whose knowledge made them targets, as human beings whose lives mattered, even though the system that destroyed them treated them as less than human. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.